Now I'd like to introduce Adrian Weller, my colleague at the Alan Turing Institute. He's a Turing Fellow, Program Director of the AI program, which is the one about making algorithmic systems fair, ethical, and transparent. He's going to lead you through an interesting discussion about counterfactual explanations and algorithmic fairness. Welcome, Adrian Weller.
Thanks very much, Christine, and welcome to all of you. I've always wanted to be on stage to thunderous applause, and this is in some ways the next best thing. At the Turing, we're very excited about the opportunities that AI offers, and I hope that you are too. I'm sure that during this CogX festival, you'll see many wonderful examples of the great things that AI is accomplishing. But of course, there are also valid concerns. We want to build the foundations to enable the deployment of AI systems across society which are trustworthy. That is, systems which should deserve our trust because they will operate in a safe and ethical way. Now, of course, there's always someone behind the algorithm, so someone that's deploying the AI system, and we must ensure that that person behaves responsibly, and that person should be held accountable if something goes wrong. That's very important. This morning, we'll focus on aspects of the AI systems themselves and consider how they should be used. This involves a lot of interesting research, which can be deeply technical, and I'm looking at Ricardo here for a great example. He'll be speaking to us in a little bit. And crucially, it intersects with other fields, which we'll hear from soon, including ethics and the law. But of course, we need also to work with other experts, including in social science, policy, a broad array of stakeholders, including industry, civil society, consumer groups, and with the general public. It's critical that we all work together to bring diverse interests into the picture and ensure that we build systems which will be good for all of us. At the Turing, we're excited to be building a program on safe and ethical AI, one of the key focuses of our AI program. And if we get this right, it will enable the right sort of governance, which will foster the right sort of responsible innovation. We're hiring, so if anyone is interested, please talk to me afterwards or look at our website for details. Key topics, key themes within this include interpretability, fairness, privacy, and robustness, among others. Today, we're delighted to have leading Turing researchers to talk about work they've been doing on interpretability and fairness. But first up, let me introduce to you two Turing Fellows, Sandra Wachter and Brent Mittelstadt. Sandra is an associate professor of law at Oxford, and Brent is a research fellow looking at ethics. Please come on up.
So, good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming out in the typically British summer weather. I'm going to start you off sort of a 5-minute primer on why we are interested in explanations and what we think explanations of algorithmic decisions should do. And then I will turn over to my colleague Sandra Wachter, who will take you through counterfactual explanations in detail and basically say a bit more about how we think it responds to some of the key requirements for explanations. So my bit of the talk will be based on a paper that was presented at FatStar earlier this year, basically looking at what are the requirements within philosophy, cognitive science, psychology, social sciences generally for explanations, and how is the field doing in terms of those requirements. So it's basically, maybe reality check is too strong of a term, but it's an overview of what has come already in the field in terms of explainable AI and where we actually need to go from here. So to start with, what sort of methods do we actually see that are popular within the field of interpretability in AI or explainable AI? So in general, what we're seeing are a type of simplified approximation of more complex models. The basic idea here is you're making a simpler approximation model to explain how a more complex black box model actually works. And there's two general types of these approximations. You have linear or gradient-based approximations and decision tree-based methods. I think the simplest way to think about what these things are, what these approximations are, is to compare them to scientific models. And I'm comparing them to scientific models in the sense that scientific models are there to provide a coarse approximation of how a physical system behaves, but not to give a full description of the phenomenon, not to give a full description of every aspect of that system. And the reason that we have scientific models is for a number of reasons. They can be very useful for engineering or for debugging or for pedagogical purposes. A great example, or a very common example of a scientific model would be Newtonian physics. Newtonian physics is great for lots of day-to-day engineering, and it's simple enough to be explained to school children. But it is, sorry about the noise, but it is not sufficient by itself for types of engineering that require high accuracy, either at very small scales or at very large scales. So a good example of this would be, in order for GPS satellites to function correctly, to be accurate, they have to account for general relativity. At very small scales, you may need to take quantum physics into account in order to be sufficiently accurate. And so essentially the sorts of things that we call explanations now have the same sort of limitations as scientific models. So this is just a very sort of crude example of the types of limitations I'm talking about. And there's a great phrase here: all models are wrong, but some are useful. It's called Box's maxim, which basically points to the fact that when you have approximations, when you have models, if you're trying to create a simpler approximation, there will necessarily be a three-way trade-off. So there'll be a trade-off between the accuracy of the approximation, the domain that the approximation covers, so in other words, how much of the more complex model does the approximation actually describe, and the accuracy of the approximation. So you're going to have a three-way trade-off between those three elements. And so just to give you some idea of sort of how this would work in practice, what I have on the screen here, I realize this might be difficult to see, is basically the blue line is a very simplistic model that we want to explain. The red line is a linear approximation of that model. So the red line is basically the explanation of that model. And depending on where you set the boundaries of the approximation, you get very, very different types of approximations. Or in other words, you get very, very different explanations of how the model functions in general. And so the problem that we're facing right now is while we have these approximations, and while we're treating them as explanations of complex black box algorithmic models, we actually have very little validation of them. We have very little information about their limitations. And if you don't have that information, then you can't really put your trust in them. You can't know where they are going to work and where they are going to break down, and where we just don't know enough about them to know whether they're accurate or not. So to compare what we're already doing to what we've seen come before in terms of philosophy and cognitive science about what makes a good explanation. So there's a wonderful paper from 2017 by an Australian philosopher by the name of Tim Miller, where basically he does a review of evidence within philosophy, cognitive science, and social sciences generally about what makes a good explanation in terms of what people prefer their explanations to do, or what features they prefer their explanations to have. And he comes to the conclusion that sort of everyday explanations, the type of explanations we're talking about here, will have three key features. So they'll be contrastive, and basically what that means is you ask for an explanation when something unexpected happens. You're asking for an explanation in comparison to some expected state. So if my glass falls to the floor, I may ask, why did the glass break? But what I'm actually asking there is, why did the glass break rather than not break? I didn't expect the glass to break, so I'm asking, why was there this unexpected event rather than the expected event? Good explanations are also selective in the sense that there are lots of possible causes, lots of valid causes for a phenomenon, for an event. And you can select from them based on what the question is that you're asking. So again, with the glass example, if I'm asking why did the glass break, valid causes of that could be because gravity exists, or because the floor that it fell onto is harder than the glass itself. But actually, I am asking because I want to know who to blame for the glass breaking. So the most valid explanation for me, or the most valid cause for me, would be because my cat knocked the glass onto the floor. And finally, good explanations are social in the sense of they're not a one-way street. And I think that's a real problem with explanations in AI in general right now, is that we're quite often thinking of explanations in terms of, I compute an explanation, I give it to you, end of story. But good explanations involve a dialogue. They let you select certain explanations and ask questions about them based on your own expectations. So I'll end there. I'll hand over to my colleague Sandra Wachter, who will tell you a bit more about what counterfactual explanations are and how we think they fit these three requirements.
Thank you very much. Yes, so I'm going to be quickly talking about the work that Brent, Mittelstadt, and Chris Russell have been doing for quite some time. And I listed here a couple of things that I came across in the last couple of years because I'm a big fan of explanation. I think they're a very useful tool, a very good first step to increase accountability in algorithmic system in general, but it might come as a surprise that that's not an undisputed view. And I've listed here my top 4 favorite things that have been thrown in my face when I said I think explanations are a good thing. The first is that people say, well, too much explanations, too much transparency in general could infringe trade secrets, intellectual property rights. Other people say it's completely technically unfeasible to do that. Anyway, there are black box systems, we don't know what's going on. The other thing is that, yes, we might have some tools to explain those systems, but it's so complicated, no layperson would ever understand what's actually going on there. And the fourth is that if you give too much transparency to an individual, then they might start manipulating and gaming the system. And I think all those considerations are valid. They have some truth to it, but I still think they're not good enough. I don't think that's a reasonable approach to say we should abandon explanations as a tool to increase accountability. But with those concerns in mind, the 3 of us got together and wrote a paper last year or so, which is called Counterfactual Explanations, Algorithmic Decisions Without Opening the Black Box. And we try to take the theoretical knowledge that Brent just explained and the concerns that we heard into consideration and think about a tool that finds a good middle ground between those. We started off from the first question for us was who actually wants an explanation, and it very much depends on the audience who are explaining something to. It could be to a regulator, it could be for the coding community. We were actually most interested in the person that is at the receiving end of a decision. So it will be the loan applicant, the job applicant, the person that has to go to prison. So from their perspective, what are the things that this person actually wants to know? And we came up with 3 different purposes for explanations. There could be more, but we came up with those 3. The first is that the person that didn't get the loan, for example, wants to understand why he or she was rejected. The person might also have an interest to challenge this decision if they felt that they have been treated unfairly. And even if they understand what was going on, and even if the decision was just, they might want to have some guidance to change their behavior to get the desired result in the future. So basically, alter future decisions. With that equipped, we started playing with the idea of using counterfactuals as explanations. And as you can see here, that counterfactuals that describe the dependency on external facts that actually led to a decision. And we have the formula here, and a very simple example of a counterfactual explanation would be you have been denied a loan because your income was £30,000. If it had been £35,000, you have been offered the loan. So that is the idea of counterfactual explanations. So what's interesting here is that what we're trying to do is we're not trying to explain everything to you. As Brent said, good explanations are selective. They just want to describe a specific thing that you're actually interested in. And if you're here at 0, where you didn't get the loan, we're going to give you information how to get from 0 to 1. We're going to give you guidance on what things would need to change to get the loan in the end. With a different graph here, again, if you hear, I don't know if you can see that, but if you hear the little red X outside the decision boundary, basically what we are doing is trying to tell you how much needs to change until you hit the decision boundary. The good thing about counterfactual explanation is that you can offer diverse sets of counterfactual explanations. I could give you this explanation, but I could also expand it further and give you a second one, which could be very interesting in terms of the idea of close possible worlds, which is the concept under which we operate. So we're basically trying to ask the question, what are the minimal possible changes under a current decision-making model that would need to change for you to get the desired result? The good thing is that you can choose from them and find the ideal one for a particular person, which might differ depending on who you are. Other advantages are, and this leads back to the concerns that are usually being raised when it comes to transparency and explainability in general, is that with counterfactual explanations, you don't need to understand the internal logic of an algorithm. You don't need to know what's going on in the black box. And counterfactual explanations can be generated even if a system is very complex, so even if it's a neural net. They are very easy to understand. Again, one of the things that people say, those systems are completely opaque and nobody really understands what's going on. With that type of counterfactual explanation, it would be very easy to understand why a decision was made in a certain way. And it is interesting because it would only show you the key variables, like the most important things that actually had an impact on the decision, not everything that is around it is just noise. And of course, the last one is that because you're only giving limited information to an individual, it's less likely to infringe on trade secret and intellectual property rights, which was one of the other concerns that we came across. Again, here with the example of the loan decision counterfactual explanation, taking it back to the individual, it's very easy for them to understand why a loan was actually denied. They understand that income played a role, right? That was one of the deciding factors in rejecting the loan application. If the income was in fact higher, that person could then go on and challenge the decision if he or she has been treated unfairly. And even if it's the case that you understand the decision, the income was measured correctly, you would need to, know that if you increase your salary over the next years, for example, you could come back and ask for an application again and might get the desired result in the future. So it would hit all those 3 points that would be interesting for an individual. Of course, the approach has a couple of limitations, and that is something that we are currently working on to address. Obviously, as I said, because you're not opening up the black box and you don't fully understand what the algorithm is doing, we still have a problem with interpretability. So that research field is still tremendously important, and I think we need to have a bigger discussion on how we govern systems that are not understandable, not even to the coding community, and how we regulate those. But counterfactual explanations are a very good interim step to give at least some understanding what's going on. The fairness question is obviously still open. I think to really understand whether a system is fair and unbiased, you would need to look at the system as a whole, not just an individual output. However, it could give some indication that something might be wrong with the system. A counterfactual explanation could also be, we would have offered you the loan if you had been a man. It doesn't necessarily mean that the whole system is completely biased, but it could give you some indication that protected attributes or unethical attributes have been used in the decision-making process. The third has to do with changing models. If you have fast-changing models and you change your income, you get a better job, you have a higher income, and you then come back and reapply for the loan, it might be that the decision-making model has changed. That might be the case, but we point in the paper to the possibility that you could artificially freeze a system and basically start having a conversation with, for example, a bank and say, well, if you increase your income over the next 6 months to a year, we would give you a loan based on the conditions that we laid out right now. And the fourth one, that's the research project that we're currently working on, is trying to figure out what closeness actually means. As I said, you can offer multiple counterfactual explanations, and it might be easier for some people to change their professions. For some people, it will be easier to move to a different city. And figuring out what closeness means to an individual and figuring out how to ethically choose from possible counterfactual explanations is one of the things that we're currently looking at. Regardless of the limitations, there's an interesting research map ahead, and I'm very excited about that because I think counterfactual explanations are a very, very good step forward in order to increase accountability in complex algorithmic systems. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sandra. we've heard from an ethicist and a lawyer, and next up we have Ricardo Silva, who is an associate professor of machine learning and statistics at UCL and a Turing fellow, to give us some technical perspective on fairness.
Thanks everybody for coming. This is joint work with, just waiting for the slides. Okay. Thank you very much. This is joint work with my esteemed colleagues Matt Kersner, Joshua Loftus, and Chris Russell, with slides kindly prepared by Matt Kersner. So what this is about? I mean, we all realize that AIs play a major role today in decision making in several different tasks, including even very life-changing questions such as parole decisions or the assessment of your credit worthiness or how much to price your insurance. All of this is part of our reality these days. But we also know there are all sorts of issues when you start to making automated decisions. And this has been going on for a while. So for instance, this is a case of about 10 years ago where some piece of tech, a camera, was particularly bad at recognizing faces of non-white people. This is not necessarily a malicious design. It can be just because of the data itself that was collected had all sorts of underrepresentative choices when being collected. So this is something that will affect our decision system because your data itself might not be representative of what you want to actually apply them to. And this continues to these days. It's not something that will go away that easily. This is a more recent example, natural language understanding, where you build an AI system to create some sort of meaning for words that you can find in natural language, which is an important task to do if you're doing, for example, CV analysis for hiring decisions. And there are recent studies showing that these words representations done by AI systems are very gender biased. They associate, for example, professionals with different genders, and this has all sorts of impactful consequences if you don't pay attention to this. And here it's not even a matter of the data not being representative of the population, because the society itself might carry these biases, and all you're doing is just replicating them. So understanding these limitations, there's of course a whole movement on trying to mitigate them. Movements done and even propelled by governments themselves, be it in the US, be it here in Europe, because you know that this is going to just be a more and more pressing issue when these systems, these automated systems, play an increasing role in our decision-making processes. So what do you do in this case? I mean, it's not a novel problem, right? You're all aware of malpractice such as redlining, where people might be denied credit just because they live in a poor neighborhood. So this has been going on for a long time. People do have some understanding which kind of measures should be implemented to combat it. But of course, the main issues is the problem of scalability. When you have now the necessity of applying these decision-making processes to a very large number of people, then it becomes more of an issue because you have less control over it. So you want one way or another to be able to scale up all these ideas that already exist on how to ensure fairness in the world. So what you propose here is going to have an explicit modeling basis on how unfairness shows up in the world, and going to integrate this in a pipeline with existing machine learning algorithms. The idea is to represent causal processes of the world on how particular outcomes came to be, and do this in a way that allows you to more clearly pinpoint what you mean by an unfair outcome, in a way that allows you to scale up to decision-making processes that might involve a large number of people, in a way that is interpretable and open to criticisms. So the bottom line here is going to be, you need to ask yourself what your decision would be had particular people belong to a different demographic group. And this is a kind of a counterfactual statement. You need to make this as precise as possible to be able to justify the design choices of your system. The lesson is if you're able to do this, you in one sense provide a certificate of fairness. And now you need to be able to formalize what is possible counterfactual enforcement should be within a mathematical model that can be exploited by an algorithm. The one example I want to show here is about on deciding whether to offer students a placement in a law school. And let me make very clear here that I'm not an educational testing researcher. I'm going to use this example just for illustrative purposes, just as a pedagogical description on how this framework can provide you tools to combat unfairness. But it's not meant to be a real-world model of all the important details that educational testing research will have to put in to make more formal claims. So this illustrative example goes as follows. An applicant comes, wanted to decide should this person get a placement in university or not. What you know about this person is his sex, gender, and 2 test results. This is for American schools, so one test is GPA, which is a summary of your high school achievements. The other is the LSAT, which is an exam that you take specifically when applying to law school. So you know this about people, you like to predict some particular measure that is useful to decide in order to give a position to this person or not. So this measure could be, for instance, how well we are going to do after the first year of law school. So you can have historical data on that. You can build a machine learning system that takes this covariance X, mapped a prediction about your first year success, and this prediction is estimated we're going to call a Y hat. This is your prediction on how well this person will do with the covariance that you see. Now, this might be problematic if you use some sort of very sensitive attributes of these people. I think it's widely recognized that using sex and race to decide on an admission process is something that should not do. So how would this alter my machine learning pipeline? Well, you may think that an easy fix to this is just not to use this covariance when building your decision-making machine learning system. So you can just erase that from your data and just do your predictions based on the remaining covariates. In this case, is the GPA and LSAT. So this is known as fairness through unawareness. So you just pretend that this information on sensitive attributes is discarded. You do the same game as before. You fit a predictive model, but now your covariance X do not include the sensitive attributes any longer. Of course, the problem with this is there is something funny going on with this covariance too. If you imagine how this GPA came to be, you may think of it as an imperfect measurement of all sorts of latent abilities of a student. So GPA is a measurement, is a proxy for latent abilities, but it might also be caused by some of the sensitive attributes. And this is known in the literature. You know, for example, that students from minorities might have, for instance, a confidence problem when doing an exam. This confidence problem may be due to all sorts of unfair processes in society. So this will carry also some unfairness into the measurement that you're trying to make. This can be applied to all sorts of other covariates that you have. So what can you do to combat that? Your features are biased too. So you may want to use some sorts of different filters to remove this unfairness. In much what is done, that doesn't use the causal process to generate the data, and we claim this cannot possibly work, not possibly fully work, because you wanted to be able to disentangle all these factors that led to your features to be biased. So here is just a very simplified cartoon of a hypothetical model that tries to explain how unfairness shows up in these measurements like GPA and LSAT. So the arrows there, you can just interpret it as causal effects relating, for instance, race and sex to GPA, while some other factors like your latent abilities, you would not be affected by that. So you want to be able to say something what I can use in my predictive model here to predict my law school grade. So you can think how to disentangle the effect of these race factors, for example, in your GPA. So if you imagine first a candidate comes, you have these features, this candidate is black, you have this predictive result y hat. You want to imagine what would have happened if this candidate had a different race. So of course, this is also a loaded term. You can imagine that what this means in different contexts is your responsibility to explain what this means. For example, you could see the case, what if these students were treated as if they were white students? What effect would that have on my outcome? So once you place this counterfactual race in the system, you can run your system forward and see how your other covariates G and L will change. Your GPA and LSAT variables could change the moment you imagine race has changed. And it can be a different result. So here, if you run your model forward, you have a different G, a different L, which means your predictions will change had this candidate belong to a different demographic group. So you don't want this to be true. So there is something fishy about using GPA in this particular example, because had this candidate been white, the GPA would be different, other things being equal according to a model. So this measure that you create, counterfactual fairness, is a way of saying you should not use covariance, not use information where your prediction will change had your individual belong to a different demographic group. So when you build a machine learning system, you need to enforce that. There are different ways of doing it. So this is just a sketch of an algorithm that basically says, do not use covariates which are caused by sensitive attributes like race and sex. You have to filter out whatever is not, whatever is caused by these covariates and use just the remaining attributes that the causal model allow you to use. So to see how this works in practice, again, this is just the conclusion of our simple law school example. So this is for real data, but the model, as I said, is just highly simplified. 20K students from the US applying to law school. So what we have here is a measure of how well you're predicting their first year average in law school using all these 4 attributes of race, sex, GPA, and LSAT. So the measure there is just a root mean squared error, how well you predict a standardized first year outcome. You, of course, do not want to use race and sex directly. If you apply this fairness through unawareness technique that I mentioned to you, you drop these 2 first covariates, use the GPA and LSAT only. Your error increases because you're using less information. In one sense, you think this is a bit more fair, so you're allowed to lose some accuracy to increase fairness. But as I mentioned to you, under my causal model, GPA and LSAT are still contaminated by biases. So use a causal model where I'm going to just infer these latent abilities U that you see there that are not caused by race and sex. You extract that using some standard machine learning techniques. That's what you plug in a machine learning pipeline for prediction. Again, your error increases, but under this idea of counterfactual fairness and the assumptions of the models, you're doing the right thing, although you're paying a price in terms of accuracy. So the takeaway messages here are, your data will be contaminated. You may not think of that, but there will be historical biases on it. You want to model that to the best of your knowledge, and the causal language allows that. Counterfactual fairness, a way of making this explicit, requires you to very clearly specify your assumptions so that you would achieve the so-called certificate of fairness. But a good side effect of that is it forces you to be as explicitly as possible and open to criticism, so people can at least say whether you're in the right track or not, right? So that's the main idea, and thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Ricardo. Can we turn on these mics? And unfortunately, Sandra had to leave to give another talk, but I'd like to invite back Brent Mittelstadt to come and join Ricardo and me here to have a short panel discussion. I think we only have until 11, and I know people will have a lot of questions. Please come have a seat. I'll just open up with one question which might be useful to help clarify some of the things we've talked about, and then we'll take questions from the floor. So I think as the first question, we've heard about counterfactual explanations from Brent and Sandra, and we've heard about counterfactual fairness from Ricardo. And I think it might be useful if you could clarify to everyone what's similar and what's different about these two types of counterfactual fairness.
Yeah. Not working really well.
Is yours dead, Brent?
Two. There we go. Handheld. Okay, so we're losing it sometimes, right?
Okay, we'll all stand around the lectern. Yeah, warm up, that's right.
Yes. So in case you missed the question, it was we have counterfactual explanations, we have counterfactual fairness. How are the two related? How are the two different? The simplest way I've heard described by Chris Russell, who worked on both projects, is that essentially counterfactuals is doing the opposite of what, counterfactual explanations are doing the opposite of what counterfactual fairness does. Just simplest way I can describe it, I'll let Ricardo maybe explain more detail because I think he's better placed to do this, is that counterfactual explanations are just telling you essentially, if you have a different output in mind that you wanted, so if you wanted to get the loan and it turned out that you didn't get the loan, counterfactual explanations tell you what would have had to been different about the world or about your particular case within the world in order to have gotten the outcome that you wanted. But
yes, I think fairness here is more related to the idea of how to change a machine learning pipeline before you design your predictive model too. So in one sense, the explanation is once you set on a machine learning method, what can you do to understand it, while our motivation comes from the very beginning before you design a machine learning solution. You should maybe alter the pipeline, change which kind of information you're going to use to build your classifier model, for instance.
Thanks very much. Let's open up to questions. Please put your hand up if you have a question. One over here. And we have someone with a mic. We're going to have someone with a mic. Maybe in the meantime, try to shout that. How can you try to find the causal data from data or in general?
Yeah, so the question was where does the causal model comes from? Yeah, so the question was where does the causal model come from that is used in things like counterfactual fairness? So it should come from a combination of data and prior knowledge. So this is about reusing knowledge that already exists and is already ingrained in some sciences like social science and psychometrics. People already have some ideas on how to build a causal model. And it's not something that you are going to do from scratch. There is already a literature there on how to do it. The main idea is, of course, it makes assumptions explicit. So in one way or another, there is something implicit in a decision making that requires this knowledge. You might as well put them in front of you as clearly as possible.
Great.
Well, I heard a question. So what if your assumptions are wrong? So your conclusions are going to be wrong. But the thing is, how do you know that is part of the idea on being forced to explain why you're deciding one particular classifier or another. There are some off-the-shelf tools for doing sensitivity analysis to be able to say, well, how sensitive my conclusions would be if particular parts of the model were different. So actually, part of our line of research is exactly on that, complementing the idea of modeling with tools for sensitivity analysis.
Great question. The question in the back? So let me try to summarize it. You're asking, how do we deal with fairness questions when the sensitive attribute itself is a good predictor of what you're actually trying to predict? How do we deal with that? Yes. It helps, yes. Good question.
Yes, so one example was age as being a predictive model for, predictive piece of information for insurance premiums. So part of the idea here is this is a judgment call to say whether some attributes should be protected or not. So for example, there are insurance companies, car insurance, which have different prices. If you are just fresh out of high school, right? If you're 18, you pay a higher premium for driving. And people are okay with that. This is a judgment call. And the framework you're designing here takes that as input. It's not going to make any judgment calls for you. It has to take a judgment in what is sensitive or not. So given that you label some particular attributes as being sensitive, you have to then calculate the consequences of that in a predictive model. But this is part of the input. This is, the machine is not going to make moral judgments for you. You need to provide this as part of your input.
You have another question?
Hello. Outside of the research world and more in private and technical industries,
Noise outside.
what is the uptake of counterfactuals in algorithms?
What's the uptake of this kind of work in the real world? Is that your question?
Yeah, outside of research, academic research.
Do you want to? Well, first, this is a relatively recent line of work, so we don't know yet. You wanted to do something that would at least make people think about why particular features should be used or not. So the idea of counterfactual fairness we came up with 2 years ago. We still try to see which directions it is going. But I think people are waking up to the fact that maybe the most important, or most crucial problem in fairness in machine learning is the bias that's already in your data. It's not necessarily the algorithm itself that is a problem. It's the fact that it's the giggle principle, right? Garbage in, garbage out. So people start to think, what does it mean to remove the bias that's already in the data? So maybe you don't need a fully fledged specified causal model for that. You do need some information or the causal process. And slowly people are getting to this idea that they do need to understand at least something about how the different factors of the world are entangled together in the generation of your inputs. So it's still early to say, but I can definitely see people understanding that something needs to be done to process your data. This is the crucial step more than anything else about the actual fitting of the data. Once you have good data, turn the crank on a machine learning method, not going to do badly. But what is the inputs that you're giving to the model? I think people are waking up to that more explicitly because of ideas like counterfactual fairness.
That's counterfactual fairness, but in counterfactual explanations, there's already been good uptake.
Yeah, so I'll tell you about the two that immediately come to mind. I should say the uptake in terms of these ideas, it may be that there are lots of people working with it and I'm just not aware of it, or essentially it's not something that's public yet. But the two that immediately come to mind, I'll start with the small one. There's actually a drone insurance company that is using counterfactual explanations to explain how your premium is calculated. Just found out about that a couple of days ago, which is, sorry? I don't, but I can check with the person that knows. Somebody else was at a presentation and saw them talking about it. So that's the small one. The bigger one, though, would be Google implemented it in their what if interface for TensorFlow. So TensorFlow is the open source machine learning package that Google supports. And so there could be all sorts of people using that in particular, where we don't know yet, or there'll be more cases emerging. So there's definitely been good uptake of it so far, and there's just in general been a lot of interest from, in particular, companies that are working in, say, insurance spaces or finance spaces where it makes sense to have these sort of contrastive explanations given to people. Basically anywhere where, if there's say a comparison website you could go on and sort of change things like how you describe your job title, it's those sorts of industries I imagine would be some of the early adopters of it.
I wanted to thank this panel, the presenters, Adrian, Brent, and Ricardo and Sandra. Brent, Ricardo, and Adrian will be available in the back and sort of meet the speakers. So if you feel like asking more questions, that's certainly an option, but it's going to give you sort of a difficult choice to make, because the next presenters are going to be talking about the ethical use of AI in public policy. So you have to sort of make choices around that. But thank you first to this panelists.